Good afternoon, students. Welcome to the second part of the lecture on international relations, its meaning, its core concerns, and the major developments that have happened in the past 75 years. In the first part, we mainly discussed the meaning of international relations, how it is important, because as we know, all the 8 billion people of the world are organized under nearly 200 states, and the relations between these states is very important for the safety and security as well as prosperity and well-being of the citizens of these 200 states. We also discussed how there are various values and concerns which are important for international relations. Under these values and concerns, we talked about the security concerns, the military security concerns. We also talked about the economic well-being of the people. We talked about the importance of international law, and we summarized by emphasizing that international relations studies and covers all these aspects, various aspects which touch upon human life. In this second lecture, we will discuss some of the major developments that have taken place since the end of the Second World War in 1945. So basically in the last 80 years. We know that the Second World War was fought between two power blocks who were called the Allied powers, which consisted of the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and many of its allies. On the other hand, there were Axis powers, which mainly consisted of the Nazi Germany, the fascist Italy, Japan, and their allies. Together with these, there were many countries which were basically the colonized world in Asia and Africa. They were also involved in the Second World War, mainly on the side of the colonial powers under whose rule they were governed. Now, the victory of the Allied powers marked the end of Second World War in 1945. The era after that witnessed the emergence of what we now call the Cold War. So the Cold War was the first and foremost major happening. We know that during the Second World War, the Allied powers consisted of US, UK, France, as well as Soviet Union. But by the end of the Second World War, differences started emerging between US, UK, and France on the one hand and Soviet Union on the other hand. There were various reasons behind the Cold War. The first and foremost was the ideological difference between the capitalist and liberal democracies of the West, which included US, UK, France, and other countries of Western Europe on the one hand, and the Soviet Union, which was a socialist country. Now, during the Second World War, in the process of liberating many of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, for example, Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union was able to promote socialist and communist governments in all these newly liberated countries. Now, this created misunderstanding among the liberal democracies and capitalist countries of the West, who believed that the Soviet Union was trying to expand its influence, was trying to convert Europe into socialist and communist system and states. On the other hand, the Soviet Union was greatly alarmed by the use of the atomic bomb against Japan by US, which created a new era in the world history, because now US had a weapon of mass destruction like never before, and the Soviet Union did not have that technology, at least in 1945-46. Therefore, there was a mistrust among the countries which became divided into two power blocks: the capitalist bloc led by the United States and followed by US, UK, France and other countries. And on the other hand, there was Soviet Union and the socialist bloc, which consisted of countries of Eastern Europe, and by 1949, People's Republic of China became a communist country and joined the socialist bloc. This rivalry between the two power blocs, between the two ideological camps, came to be known as the Cold War. The history of the world for the next 40-45 years, from 1945 till 1985-1990, is referred to as the Cold War, and this is the most important development in the post-World War period. During this period, we saw many reasons because of which the differences between the two power blocs aggravated. One was, for example, the partition of Germany. Eastern Germany, during the course of last months of the Second World War, came under the protection and occupation of Soviet Union. On the other hand, the Western countries, that is US, UK and France, occupied three parts of West Germany. Now, after the end of Second World War, Germany was divided between the capitalist and socialist bloc, and this became, for example, the Berlin blockade. This became a major issue between the two power blocs. Similarly, there were many other regional blocs which aggravated the differences between the two power blocs. One can mention the Korean War of early 1950s, which resulted in the partition of Korea. On the one hand, there was North Korea, which was supported by Soviet Union and Communist China. On the other hand, there was South Korea, which was supported by the capitalist bloc, mainly United States. Similarly, in 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was such a major issue that there were chances of a nuclear exchange between the two power blocs during 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. Similarly, the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, one can trace its origin during the Second World War, when France, which was the colonial power which controlled Vietnam, which was liberated by Japan during the course of Second World War. But after the defeat of Japan, France once again tried to gain control of Vietnam, but it could not maintain that control. And finally, in 1954, France had to withdraw from Vietnam. Subsequently, Vietnam came under the protection, North Vietnam came under the protection of Communist Soviet Union and China, and South Vietnam was being supported by the United States of America. Beginning with mid-1960s, for the next 8-10 years, the United States tried to defeat the forces of Communist North Vietnam, but it did not succeed. And finally, the Vietnam War came to an end in 1973-75, when the United States had to acknowledge the existence of a communist government in North Vietnam. During this period, many anti-colonial movements emerged. We know about the Indian freedom struggle, which had been going on since the end of 19th century and which picked up momentum during the first few decades of the 20th century, leading to independence of India in 1947. Subsequently, many other countries, for example, Sri Lanka or Ceylon, became independent in 1948. during 1950s and 1960s, many more countries of Asia, for example in Southeast Asia and subsequently in Africa, became independent. These independent countries provided a new venue and provided a new aspect to international relations during 1950s and 60s. And they started a new movement which was called the non-aligned movement, which basically sought to maintain equidistance from the two power blocks, the capitalist bloc led by US and the socialist bloc led by Soviet Union. These newly independent countries of Asia and Africa sought to maintain equidistance. The Arab-Israel conflict, we know how in the past 10 months since October 2024, the Palestinian conflict has assumed a new configuration, but the origin of this conflict can be traced back to 1948 when Israel declared its independence, but the independence of Israel was not acknowledged by the Arab countries who fought a war against Israel in 1948, then in 1967 and again in 1973. The Arab-Israel conflict has continued. The issue of Palestinian independence and Palestinian state has continued to bedevil relations between Israel and other countries in the Arab world. Similarly, many other developments have taken place. The Gulf War of 1990-91 was one major issue. This happened during the last years of the Soviet Union, when Soviet Union was trying to implement many domestic reforms under Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost programs, and he was also trying to improve relations with the countries of Western world, the United States and Western Europe under his new political thinking on foreign policy. The Gulf War happened in 1990-91 when Iraq under Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Iraq was an ally of Soviet Union. Kuwait was an ally of United States, but the two countries agreed, I mean the United States and Soviet Union agreed that Iraq had violated international law and therefore Iraq must be made to withdraw from Kuwait. This led to American military action against Iraq in January 1991, and this was very important because during this war the Soviet Union did not side with Iraq and in fact stayed neutral, and therefore convinced the West and United States that Soviet Union really wants to improve relations with them and also wants a peaceful international environment. Similarly, during the post-Second World War period, we have seen many secessionist movements in many countries of the world, most notably in Soviet Union and the former Yugoslavia, on the issue of self-determination. Now these secessionist movements, whether it was in Soviet Union or Yugoslavia or in many other countries of the world, have created a new challenge for the countries of the world which are facing not just secessionism but also extremist measures and terrorism which is being practiced by the movements and groups who want self-determination. Another important conflict during this period was the conflict in the Balkans. The Bosnian conflict of 92-95 and the Kosovo War of 1999 posed a major challenge to the international order and highlighted the importance of human rights, because the Western countries believed that in Kosovo the human rights of Albanian minority was being violated by the Serb majority, and therefore they resorted to bombardment of Kosovo against Serbia. This was perceived by many other countries, for example, Russia and some other countries, as violation of international law, which believes in respect for territorial integrity and non-violation of sovereignty of countries. Therefore, these conflicts brought West and Russia face to face, and subsequently it became one of the major issues between US and the West on the one hand, and Russia, China and other countries on the other hand. Some of the other most important issues which can be considered as game changers in the last 25 years, one can mention among these the 9/11 attacks which happened in September 2001 against New York and Washington, against the World Trade Center, and this marked a new beginning in international relations because it highlighted the threat posed by international terrorism, which earlier had been an issue, but it was not faced so much by the countries like US and Western Europe. It was only countries like India or Russia or China which were talking about the threat from extremism, from separatism, from terrorism, the three evils. But now US and the West was faced with these challenges, and they realized that it needs to be tackled collectively. There were many other issues which have become important in the last 25 years. One can mention the Iraq war of 2003. It was important because after the success of the war against terror, against Al-Qaeda and Taliban in Afghanistan, United States, we know after the 9/11 attacks, resorted to drastic military measures to destroy international terrorist networks, mainly promoted by Al-Qaeda and Taliban, based in Afghanistan. Now, the success of US in Afghanistan led it to believe that now the world was ripe for the US to implement a new world order, which will be, in their estimation, according to US wishes, more democratic, which would follow capitalist style of economy. So, following this, the US invaded Iraq in 2003 in order to remove Saddam Hussein, which they believed was pursuing weapons of mass destruction, which they believe was violating human rights of the Kurdish minority, of the Shia minority, and therefore the US invaded Iraq. But Russia, China, and even France believed that this was a violation of international law because it violated the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Iraq. The differences between US on the one hand and Russia and China on the other, one can trace Iraq war as an important milestone in this trajectory. The Georgia war of 2008, similarly, August 2008, was very important because it was the first time that Russia took military action against Georgia by claiming that Georgia was violating the human rights of people of South Ossetia and Abkhazia, where international peacekeeping force, including force from Russia, was protecting these two territories, but the Georgian government tried to retake these two territories, which was opposed by Russia, and therefore the Georgian war happened. It is also believed that Russia took action against Georgia because during that time there were already talks about inclusion of Georgia into NATO and EU, and followed by Georgia, even Ukraine was supposed to start negotiations for joining NATO and European Union. In 2008, Russia made it very clear that the expansion of NATO, which was going on since 1999, happened in 2004, which Russia objected to because Russia believed that after the end of the Cold War, there was no justification for continuance of NATO and NATO should be disbanded. But contrary to it, NATO decided to include more than 12 countries as members, and many of these countries were formerly communist states. Russia could not do much, but when it came to Georgia and Ukraine, which were part of the Soviet Union, and therefore they were part of what Russia considered to be its near abroad, Russia believed that NATO should not include countries which were part of Soviet Union, especially Georgia and Ukraine, and therefore the war happened. The differences between Russia and the West, US and the West, increased subsequently when in 2013 Ukraine decided to start negotiations for association with EU and NATO. However, the then government of Yanukovych in Ukraine was persuaded by Russia to stop these negotiations and instead decided to side with Russia and perhaps join Russian-led CSTO and the Eurasian Economic Community, which was to be launched in 2015. But the people of Ukraine came out on the streets. Yanukovych had to flee Ukraine, and that prompted Russia to take action against Ukraine. Russia decided to reintegrate Crimea, which was earlier a part of Russia, a part of Soviet Union, which Russia had gifted to Ukraine, but which contained an important military base, naval base of Russia in Sevastopol. So in 2014, Russia decided to reintegrate Crimea, and the Crimea War happened. The Crimea War led to long-standing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, because after reintegration of Crimea, Russia started supporting separatist and secessionist in two of the eastern provinces of Ukraine, which had Russian majority and which wanted autonomy within Ukraine. Russia believed that Ukraine should give autonomy to these two provinces of Donetsk and Lugansk, which had Russian majority, even though these provinces should remain within Ukraine. But when Russia was convinced that Ukraine was not giving autonomy to these provinces, and Ukraine insisted on its right to become member of NATO and EU, finally in February 2022, Russia decided to take military action against Ukraine, and we have seen how in the last nearly 3 years the Ukraine war has been going on. In the last 8 months, we have seen a new war in Gaza, which started when some of the Palestinian extremists attacked Israel in October 2024, and since then the war has been going on. Apart from these military conflicts, the world has also seen many economic crises in the last 80 years or 100 years, which have had very significant impact on international relations and on international politics. The economic instability, we know, can have very adverse impact on world politics. One can count the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s, which initially started in United States but later on spread to Europe and affected many other countries and regions of the world. It showed the dangers of market crash and market conditions on national economies. Such financial and economic crises can be seen in subsequent period also. For example, nearly 50 years back in 1973, the first oil shock took place when the OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which is a cartel, decided to increase the price of oil fourfold, and that created a severe economic crisis for the rest of the world, which included countries of Europe and North America, but also affected the countries of Asia and Africa. Such oil shocks happened during late 1970s and 1980s also. This had a very adverse impact on the economy of all the countries which were dependent on oil and gas imports from the OPEC countries or from other oil and gas exporting countries, including Russia. Similarly, in 1997-98, we saw a financial crisis which initially started in Southeast Asia but spread to Latin America, to Eastern Europe and even Russia. In 2008, the Great Recession, which was a worldwide financial crisis, which started sometimes in 2007 and lasted till 2009, it severely impacted, first and foremost, United States of America. We know how many of the international institutions and banks came under severe crisis during this period. So, the point that I am trying to emphasize is that there have been various issues during the last 80 years which cover both security and economic crises, which have impacted the world like nothing else. In conclusion, I would like to say that the states and the system of states, which are basically territory based social organizations, have been going through various crises and which has affected the global values, security, freedom, order and justice, as well as the welfare of the people. Many states, especially in the developed world, successfully perform the functions that were initially stipulated for the international system. These countries have set the international standards and also norms for the rest of the world. But many states, especially in the underdeveloped world, what we now call the global south, for them the international system has really not met their expectations, have adversely impacted their well-being, their security, as well as having adverse impact on their socio-economic condition. This led to a debate between the traditional IR theorists, who by and large view the existing world order and state system in positive terms, and radical theories who by and large view these the existing international system and system of states in negative terms. Therefore, the subsequent lectures will deal with these various IR theories, some of which can be called as traditional theories and some which have come up in the last 30-40 years and which seek to address the concerns of the global south. There are some suggested readings. I am very sure the students will benefit from them. Thank you very much.